A little bit quieter today, there's stuff going on apparently around the campus. So I'd like to say hello to two guests from La Trobe. You guys could just quickly introduce yourselves.
Kate Middleton, I'm a sports biomechanicist from La Trobe University. I'm over here visiting John Leet, so we're both on a grant that we submitted to the Defence Force in Australia, looking at movement variability and both carriage and injury risk. So I'm over here for the week to discuss that with you.
Hey, I'm Alex Roberts. I'm also from La Trobe, and I'm a skill acquisition scientist, mostly looking at coaching science. I'm over here to do some work with Keith Davids and also present at the SPARC symposium that's happening on Thursday, which is on the use of technology to look at movement quality and improving movement in kids. So if you guys are interested on Thursday, come along to that. It'll be fun.
Thank you, Alex. That is a good nudge for you all. What you probably saw the email from me today or yesterday from the Trobe Partnership. So we're doing reciprocal funding for projects. So if you want to chat about that, give me a shout or John Wheat, because that really has started a lot of the conversations that we've had in terms of joint collaborative bids and stuff. So it's a really good opportunity. So do have a look at that and give us a shout.
We're here based on that grant funding, so we applied for the internal grant funding at La Trobe, and that got us over here, so it's well worth it.
That's great. And pick the time of year, so obviously January in Melbourne is lovely. Bit more cold here at the time. So yeah, do have a look at that. It might be worth having a chat with those guys as well, or certainly John and myself for opportunities on that funding call. Just very quick one from me. Side Chopping was going to do a summary on the graduate school. So we're not going to necessarily do that. Just to summarise the role of the graduate school is, to provide a network and support for the PhD students, so collaborative opportunities for training and links in with the academic teams. I know we've got two of the research group leads, Simon and Nushka, here today. So we have SPARC, for those of you that may not have had all the information yet, which is our academy research centre. We then have the four research groups of physical activity wellbeing, public health, sport and youth performance, sport industry, and sport engineering. So beneath those four groups, we have no limit necessarily, but we have a number of themes that are emerging that staff are starting to drive. Some of whom, for example, the Outdoor Recreation Research Group, we've now got funding, we've now got some collaborative grants submitted. We've got groups like Strength Conditioning, Shoe Strength, the Artificial Intelligence Group, I think one of Simon's group is leading. So there's a range of different groups there, and again, if people are interested, I did send some information around last week. We've now got really quite a thorough set of content describing the different themes that are emerging. So again, I'll send that around when I've got more information. I'll probably attach that to the new SharePoint site, because that's pretty much ready to go. So without further ado, I'm going to invite, we've got Josh and Alex who are going to present their work. Complex titles, so I'll let you describe which one you do.
I'll do my best.
Okay, thanks guys.
Well, thanks for coming, everyone. So what I'm going to do with my presentation is just present an overview of what I'm planning to do at the moment for my PhD. So we started it in May, so I'm about 6 months in now. So the title, Non-pharmacological interventions to ameliorate sarcopenia in patients with chronic heart failure. So sort of provide an overview of what that means and then what and why we're doing. So firstly, what is sarcopenia? So it's a muscle disease, which essentially means you lose muscle mass, you also lose muscle performance and muscle quality. So as we age, everybody loses their muscle mass. From the age of 40 onwards, muscle strength and mass reduces by sort of 3% in the lower body and 1 to 2% in the upper body. Men tend to retain a little bit more upper body mass. Women tend to lose both lower and upper body muscle mass as well. Now, after 80 years of age, this decline accelerates even faster. So it affects our independence, health-related quality of life, and it is a predictor for all-cause mortality as well. So that's the sarcopenia part covered. So heart failure. So what is heart failure? So it's a clinical syndrome, symptoms including breathlessness, swelling, fatigue, and what it essentially means is there's a reduced blood flow either out of the left ventricle to the rest of the body, or the blood flow into the left ventricle is restricted, which then results in less blood leaving ultimately and getting out into the body. So there's structural abnormalities in the heart that can cause this, and or functional abnormalities as well. So there's no one thing which can cause it. It can be a variety of different things. So there's three categories, although one of them is up for debate as to whether it's really a thing. So you've got preserved ejection fraction, which means that there's less blood ultimately getting into the left ventricle, usually as a result of reduced pressure in the heart. So there's less pressure pulling that blood into the heart, so less blood can essentially leave when the heart beats. Then you've got mid-range ejection fraction, which is where the blood coming into the ventricle isn't hampered, but the blood being pumped back out of the ventricle is slightly reduced, below 50%. So above 50% is generally considered a healthy ejection fraction. And then we've got reduced ejection fraction, which is where you've got less than 40% of the blood in the ventricle being ejected and out to the rest of the body. So, why does sarcopenia matter? What impact does it have, and how common is it? So 10% of older individuals in the community will end up with sarcopenia. The incidence is twofold in patients with heart failure. So 1 in 10 in general, 1 in 5 for patients with chronic heart failure. So the precise impact economically of sarcopenia is unknown, but when you factor in muscle weakness overall, so the associated things that go with that, so trips and falls, care, lack of independence, and other problems that can arise due to that, it's been reported to cost the NHS £2.5 billion per year. So when we think about the headlines that we see of the NHS already struggling with budget and staffing, it's a big burden on the NHS there. And as I said before, low skeletal muscle mass in general is associated with 5-year increased risk of 5-year all-cause mortality and other predictors of all-cause mortality, so particularly low aerobic fitness. So diagnosing sarcopenia. So at the moment, strength is the primary outcome measure that's used to diagnose the presence of sarcopenia. That's because strength is the most reliable measure of muscle function. So it's all well and good having loss of muscle, but if that muscle doesn't work or isn't functional, can't help you stand up, can't help you dress yourself, wash yourself, prepare food, it's not really much use. So the predominant test that's used for that is grip strength, and there's different values for men and women used in diagnosing sarcopenia there. If for whatever reason grip strength can't be used, you can also perform 5 sit to stand in a chair, and if it takes longer than 15 seconds, then that can suggest the presence of sarcopenia. It always has to be confirmed, going by current best practice, using skeletal muscle mass. So actually confirming it by checking is there a significant reduction in muscle mass. So treatment. So no established treatment exists for sarcopenia. Now there's lots of things that have been shown to be linked or associated with the onset and the progression of sarcopenia. So there's links between inactivity and malnutrition, so people who live sedentary lifestyles, either due to injury or illness, or just in general, and malnutrition, particularly low protein intake. And we know that protein is associated with maintaining or increasing lean muscle mass. Low protein intake has also been identified as the strongest predictor of developing sarcopenia in patients with heart failure. And as we said before, Sarcopenia affects around 1 in 10 people, but 1 in 5 if they have heart failure as well. Other studies have also reported malnutrition for macronutrient and micronutrient intake in patients with heart failure. So it's not just insufficient protein, it's insufficient carbohydrates, it's insufficient fats, and the vitamins and minerals which help us to unlock the benefits of those macronutrients as well. Now, resistance training has been shown to increase strength, skeletal muscle mass, and aerobic fitness in healthy individuals, elderly individuals, and individuals with chronic heart failure, particularly when combined with protein supplementation, and in particular leucine, which is an essential amino acid. What that means, you've got 2 types of essential amino acid: non-essential, which means that the body can synthesize them themselves from other proteins, and essential amino acids, which mean the body can't produce them and you have to get them from the diet. And leucine has been shown to be one of the most important amino acids for synthesizing new lean tissue. So if no treatment exists, it makes sense to think that if you can try and modify the lifestyle factors related to the onset and progression of sarcopenia, then perhaps we can reduce the impact and the effect of it. So grip strength, as we said, is the primary diagnostic tool for sarcopenia. Now, normative data in healthy populations only takes age into account currently. So if skeletal muscle mass is used to confirm the presence of sarcopenia, there's the question of why it isn't used in general to classify whether someone's strength is above or below the normal range in a healthy population. Grip strength has also been shown to be a predictor for cardiovascular disease. So is there a relationship between grip strength and cardiovascular risk factors in currently healthy individuals? We also want to know if chronic heart failure impacts energy expenditure. Research has shown that in other chronic conditions such as COPD, resting energy expenditure during sort of activities of daily living, so cleaning, walking up and down flights of stairs, relatively simple tasks for healthy individuals, they have a higher energy expenditure, they burn more calories than healthy individuals. So when we go back and think that patients with heart failure aren't getting enough nutrients, maybe it's that they're eating the same as they did before they had their diagnosis, and they're not compensating for the extra energy demand being placed on them. So that's the next question: what influences the dietary habits of patients with heart failure? If studies are reporting that they're not getting enough protein or other nutrients, well, what's influencing that? Are they not being given the right advice? Are they not able to? Do they not know? What's going on there? And then finally, can those lifestyle factors be modified in order to treat the condition? So the aim of the PhD, building on the existing knowledge that we have around sarcopenia diagnosis and treatment in patients with chronic heart failure. So we want to collect data from healthy individuals as well as individuals with heart failure and try and target those gaps that we discussed. So we want to gain further understanding of grip strength data and look at the relationship between grip strength and cardiovascular risk factors. So if anyone knows, for staff within the university, there's the Shoe Wellness program that's running. So we see around about 1,000 healthy individuals per year. So we've got a massive cohort that we can gain grip strength data from, and also other cardiovascular risk factors. So blood pressure, blood lipid profile, so cholesterol, body fat percentage, waist and hip ratios, and predicted VO2 max as well. Then we want to explore energy expenditure and nutrient intake in patients with heart failure. So we want to see how does their energy expenditure differ compared to healthy individuals, but then also what is impacting their nutrient intake and why. And then finally, assessing the feasibility of an intervention informed by the other studies, combining exercise and protein supplementation. Now, as protein has been leucine enriched, so it's added leucine, which is the amino acid that's really crucial for gaining muscle mass on patients with heart failure and sarcopenia to see if we can potentially reverse or prevent the progression of sarcopenia in those individuals. So that's a quick overview there. Just want to say thanks to the supervisory and advisory team, Simon Nichols, who's in the room, and Tom Morkinson as well, and some of the guys who aren't here today.
So we have questions for Alex?
I'm just pressing buttons, maybe. Press the right one. There we go.
Any questions for Alex?
So you said there would potentially an intervention study at the end. How long would that study need to be in order for significant changes to take place as a result of either change in nutrition or
Yeah, so the study that we're proposing to do at the moment is a feasibility trial. So it's not going to be a fully powered RCT. It's going to be a smaller scale RCT looking to test can we recruit participants from that population. Is the intervention feasible? So will they take part in it basically? And we plan to run that study for 18 months. So can we recruit? We're looking to recruit 30 participants over 15 months to hopefully allowing for a 20% attrition rate, 24 participants that have finished. So from the data that we've looked at and from the recommendations for feasibility studies, we want at least 12 participants per group. So that's what we've planned for after that.
And they're drawn from Chihuahuas.
Not for the intervention, no. So we've got contact with a cardiac rehab clinic down in Coventry, so we're going to be working with them.
What's the actual intervention?
So they'll be doing the normal cardiac rehab as prescribed there, and then 2 servings a day of protein, leucine-enriched protein. There's a placebo group as well, so it's 6 grams of leucine per day.
Other question?
And sorry, the cardiac rehab is a combination of aerobic and resistance training.
Others haven't. Can I just ask the population, we're obviously trying to do a lot more work in healthy aging in the workforce. What's the onset, what's the age at which this starts to accelerate and show itself? When you say older adults, how old?
Yeah, so the muscle decline muscle typically starts to decline from 40 to 45, and then as you get older it tends to accelerate, and then particularly from 80 onwards it really accelerates. But yeah, so 40 to 45 when we start to see significant reductions.
That's why you talk about 2.5 billion in NHS costs, sick days and absence days and presenteeism, absenteeism, all of that in the work, which could probably double, triple that amount. So
yeah, so even
interesting looking at that.
not just the healthcare.
Just
talking about the mode of training, does that matter? Do you have to sort of account for sort of individual preferences of exercise, or how do you quantify that?
Yeah, so that's something that we've had lengthy discussions about to try and control, and how can we quantify the dose of exercise. During the sessions, RP is recorded, so rate of perceived exertion, which is being validated to show the perceived intensity of the exercise. We spoke about trying to record heart rate during the sessions, but working with heart failure patients, they can often have something called chronotropic incompetence, which is where their heart doesn't respond as it should to exercise, so it's not really a valid representation of how hard they have or haven't been working. So the good thing about working with the clinic that we are is they've got a fully trained team of cardiac rehab specialists. So they produce the programs, they're all done supervised by them, and they're filled out by the instructors as they progress through them. So we will have some record at the end of how many sessions they've attended and what they've done during those sessions. So part of the feasibility is, aside from attending the data collection sessions, is 80% adherence to supplementation, 80% adherence to the exercise program as well.
Simon? And then Helen?
Just if you do the hand.
Will you be taking into consideration women who have gone through the menopause or in the menopause? Do they have muscle loss as a result of that?
That's a very good question. That isn't something that we've considered at the moment, but that is definitely something that we'll need to look into.
So, Simon?
I was just going to ask if you could really briefly explain what the relationship is between the heart failure itself and what happens to the muscle in the heart failure patients. What's the relationship between muscle and heart failure?
Yeah, so as we said, when you've got heart failure, there's less blood essentially leaving the heart and getting around the body. So you've got less blood getting around the body to the muscles, which means the muscles aren't getting the nutrients that they need. There's conflicting opinions as to does that actually change the physical structure and quality of the muscle itself, and do those changes then cause the reduction in muscle mass and strength, or is it that just the lack of blood and the fact that it's harder to exercise at higher intensities and maintain that, does that then cause the reduction? So there's Simon's got another PhD student working up in Northumbria looking more at the muscle architecture side of things. So hopefully by the end of it we'll have sort of two interventions or two potential answers to that question.
And the better research will clearly be from Sheffield. Holly?
With the right kind of nutrition and the right kind of exercise, how much recovery of muscle mass or how much attenuation of the sarcopenia might you expect? What's the kind of best case scenario you might expect?
I don't know what to expect. I think there's going to be limiting factors in terms of the severity of heart failure, and then the adherence to it as well. There's also a concept called anabolic resistance in older individuals, so it may be that older individuals that are part of the trial will have less of a response to the protein supplementation than younger participants as well. So it'll be interesting to see at the end of it if we recruit and if we get everyone we want to and the interventions is feasible, what the preliminary data shows as well.
Wow. Thank you very much. Thanks for that, Alex.
Thanks.
Let's now invite Josh. We'll get Josh set up, who's talking about physical impairment and thermoregulations. So we'll just take a minute or so to this.
Anyone want a biscuit?
Biscuit? You kick my muscle mass. Yeah.
I haven't thanked you in my presentation. I feel quite bad now.
Try hold it down.
It's a code, yeah.
It is, isn't it? There we go. Okay, Josh.
Yes, so my PhD is in kind of thermoreg and how physical impairment affect thermoregulation and thermoregulatory mechanisms. But this presentation itself will look kind of at the piece of research I'm doing at the moment, which is a kind of systematic review of what we currently know. So just kind of an overview to what is the response to heat. So there's an increase in cardiovascular strain, sweat rate, you get core temperature and skin temperature increases, and an increase in RPE. That is seen for everybody, able-bodied, disabled person, whether you're kind of acclimated or not, you will get those responses. It just depends on kind of the level of that response. And then you also get a decrease in thermal comfort. So moving on to kind of impairment. In 1996, prior to the Atlanta Paralympic Games, the British Paralympic Association kind of highlighted heat as a major influencing factor on Britain's success at the Games. Off the back of that, Wayman produced a piece of work that, as well as kind of discussing the issues, highlighted three groups that would be kind of most affected, which were athletes with a spinal cord injury, athletes with bilateral amputations, and athletes with cerebral palsy. Kind of 23 years later, looking into the Tokyo Paralympics next year, kind of thermoregulation and physical impairment has become a kind of big topic. Looking into the conditions of Tokyo, it's going to be kind of 27, 28 degrees Celsius, and then upwards of kind of 80% relative humidity. So there's a big focus at the moment, kind of what are kind of our athletes' responses to heat, and looking at what can we do to kind of help them perform at their peak at the Games. So we've taken the three groups that Webben discussed and based them for our review. So first looking at spinal cord injury, that hasn't really changed from Webben's paper, and that's a relatively well-researched group within ParaScore. So a lot of the research is focused on the autonomic dysfunction that you get with the spinal cord injury, comparing athletes with the spinal cord injury in the heat to able-bodied participants doing a similar test. It's the same conditions, same relative intensity, and then as well as cooling methods for those athletes with SCIs. Now, a lot of what this research has done has kind of told us what happens. So we know that because of the autonomic dysfunction, the vasomotor and pseudomotor responses are limited below the lesion, so they don't really sweat and they can't lose heat through conduction or radiation because the blood flow isn't there. And obviously the higher the lesion, the more their thermoregulatory responses are impaired. The main limitation of a lot of the research around spinal cord injuries is that a lot of the papers don't actually take the SCI athletes in a cool environment, test them on the performance indicator, and then retest them in the heat. A lot of them just kind of compare the responses to an able-bodied athlete, or just compare how can we call them, what are the responses kind of physiologically in terms of heart rate, plasma volumes, core temperatures, but not actually how does that relate to their performance. If we move on now to the second group, so amputation. So Webber initially just looked at bilateral amputees, so kind of both limbs. We've expanded that slightly to all forms of amputation, as well as limb deficiency, so we're looking at kind of congenital and acquired. A lot of the research around this has focused on the fact that a prosthetic socket is kind of a heat block. The many kind of components and materials that go into it really limit the ability to lose heat from that area, as well as kind of the vascular anomalies that you get with amputations. Typically you'll get a lower skin temperature at the stump, at the kind of the end of that remaining limb, compared to the full limb. The impact that has on thermoregulation is, it might seem kind of counterintuitive, it's cooler and better. What it means is you get reduced blood flow to that area, which is why it's cooler. So it means when you're looking at then trying to kind of dissipate heat and lose heat, if you have a reduced blood flow to that area, you're not going to get that same vasodilation response to kind of spread that heat and help it to lose. And then the final one, similar to with SCIs, it's comparing an able-bodied participant and their core temperature to an amputee and their core temperature. So the limitations, there's a really, really limited number of papers. There's not a huge amount of research. Similar to the SCIs, a lot of these don't actually measure the performance kind of in heat and not in heat to see what is the level of impact that it has. And a lot of the papers don't actually look at kind of thermal comfort or rate of perceived exertion. They look at these core temperature changes and skin temperature changes, but don't actually look at the feelings of the participants, which kind of when we're working with athletes in the heat, such a vital measure to have. And then finally, neurological impairment. So Webben's paper was focused purely on cerebral palsy. We've expanded that into all neurological impairments. So hypothalamic dysfunction, which you get as kind of disrupted brain development, which you would see in cerebral palsy, has a similar, and it kind of goes on to the autonomic dysfunction that you get with SCIs, is also present in a number of neurological impairments. So kind of the reasoning between SCIs and neurological for why those thermoregs can be affected are very similar. We also know that, for example, multiple sclerosis, they have kind of reduced thermal comfort. And then the final thing with neurological impairments is the inefficiency of their movement causes an increased metabolic heat gain. So even if their kind of thermoregulatory response itself is unaffected, the actual amount of heat they have to remove is greater because of that inefficiency. And then the limitations, again, similar to amputations, just the amount of research that's been done is so small. In the review we're doing at the moment, there's less than 10 papers for amputations, less than 10 for neurological impairments, and there's kind of 20, 30 papers for for spinal cord injuries, which is still a relatively low number, but in comparison to the other two, it's kind of a wealth of knowledge. And there's also a number of kind of issues with methods in papers that have looked at neurological impairments, in kind of their participant recruitment and the tests that they've got them to do. It's kind of, some big flaws in some of the methodology. So what's next? So kind of what the PhD is doing. So as I said, we're currently doing a scoping review. That's a systematic, that's a type of my part, into physical impairment and thermoreg. After that, we're going to actually look at how does heat affect performance for disabled athletes, for para-athletes. What actually is the level of change? We know able-bodied athletes kind of between 6 and 16% reduction in performance across various measures, and we don't really have that data for para-athletes. And then finally looking into heat acclimation for para-athletes. How effective is it? Does it happen? And then also the different protocols that are available, is short, medium, longer term. What is the most effective method to acclimate para-athletes to the heat when they do get to competitions, they can perform at the best. I did thank Alex, sorry. But yeah, any questions?
Thanks, Josh. Well done. Could reframe that to it's such a unique and ripe area for research, which is why there's not the papers there, but fascinating area of research. Questions? A few. Alex?
So I know you said there's not a lot of papers out there, but so you said that due to movement inefficiency, that reduces the ability to thermoregulate. So are there any papers that have shown then that it hampers long duration event athletes compared to, say, strength sport athletes?
In terms of the efficiency, it's not necessarily that it affects the ability to thermoregulate. It taxes the requirement, the need to regulate slightly more. So it might be that actually the ability to thermoregulate is fine. It's just there's just more heat that has to be lost. So therefore it affects it a little bit more. In terms of strength sports, I don't think there's a lot of research, not that I've seen. We do know that typically for kind of really short duration sprint events, the heat doesn't really have that much of an impact, obviously kind of from able-bodied stuff, just because the duration of the exercise isn't long enough for the kind of physiological responses to hinder it. So I think for a strength sport, probably not. It's just not a long enough activity for the kind of cardiovascular strain and things like that to play a part. In terms of a para-athlete, kind of if over the course of if they're competing on the second week of the Paralympics, for example, but they've been there for a week already, kind of just their day-to-day life within that environment might tax them and they might get kind of fatigue, but I can't give you an answer about that kind of now.
You have all the answers. Any other questions? Come on.
Was there particular sports you were going to look into? Because you mentioned that the strength sports might not be as big of a factor, but were there particular endurance sports we were going to look at?
We haven't really limited it to any particular sports at the moment, just so that we're focusing less on a specific sport and more just kind of what is the response of athletes. So we're reluctant to say, okay, we're looking at 400 metre races, or we're looking at X, Y, or Z, just so that we can have kind of the widest ability to recruit, so that we can get a kind of large data set that's going to be applicable to a wide range.
Alex?
Oh, that was my question.
Pretty much.
When you said there were flaws in the methodologies of some of the papers, what are those flaws? Can you do to make sure that?
Yeah, so there's a couple of key ones, and we're looking at neurological impairments. There's a research group that have looked at children with cerebral palsy, and they conducted a study on a treadmill comparing to able-bodied children, and found that there was big increases in core temperature, and they said there's definitely a difference in the ability of children with cerebral palsy to thermoregulate to an able-bodied child. Then they all had CP in their lower body. They then repeated the study with arm crank exercise and concluded that there was no difference because they didn't have the same kind of differences. However, in their own limitations in the study, they talk about the participants they recruited couldn't keep up the cadence on the arm crank that they required. So I think it was 8 of their 9 participants presented predominantly with spasticity in their legs and not in their upper body. Obviously, if you're looking at upper body exercise, if you don't have CP in your upper body, or it's enough to affect your upper body, you're probably not really going to see a difference because you're kind of comparing like to like almost. So kind of the conclusion that there's no difference doesn't really make any sense. They haven't really tested people with upper body cerebral palsy and upper body exercise. And knowing people that have CP in their upper body that do arm crank exercise quite regularly, I know that they struggle, so kind of with heat. So.
Can I just go on?
Just quick ones. I guess my sort of limited understanding of sort of neurological impairments. The environment obviously then has a quite big factor on whether people can actually perform, and I guess then also the kind of the efficiency of the movement. So I wonder if there's any way of, I guess, kind of making those comparisons to match with potentially healthier able-bodied participants, that kind of thing. If you're able to look at people in their movements in a more natural environment for them, rather than an ergometer, for example. Or something like that.
I think kind of the reason that arm crank or ergo is used is it's just a kind of a good laboratory-based exercise. I understand, I think I understand kind of where you're getting at, but I think if we're looking at kind of measuring athletes and their performance and their responses, we need a slightly more controlled environment so that we can actually kind of get all of the physiological data that we need. And it's just a case of recruiting participants that can do it. I know that sounds like a bit of a kind of cop-out answer, but you know, there's plenty of kind of athletes with neurological impairments that can do arm crank exercise that are affected in their upper body. It's just kind of that paper just kind of decided that the discipline they had access to didn't, and there's got a lot of issues with a few of the other papers within amputations as well. They're kind of looking at time to completion. The core temperatures were the same for the able-bodied athletes and the amputee athletes, but there was a 2-hour time difference in time to completion of the exercise. But they concluded there was no difference. But kind of, as I mentioned on the thing, there was no kind of RPE, there was no thermal comfort measures. So I'm looking at that and saying, potentially 2 hours longer, your core temperature might be the same, but there's something else happening. It's not just that they walk slower. Maybe they walk slower, but if it's 2 hours longer, there's going to be some sort of kind of impact.
What's the question? We're in for an item. Sam? And then to did you?
Yeah. I'm just interested in whether this sort of phenomenon happens across the entire intensity spectrum. Does it appear? Does the thermoregulation issues that you described happen at the light and moderate intensity domains, like below the first ventilatory threshold, or?
So a lot of the research that's been done around with kind of SCIs and things like that is at kind of 50 to 60% of the O2 peak. Off the top of my head, I can't give you the value for the lower level. obviously kind of the higher your intensity of exercise that you're doing, the higher that metabolic kind of heat production, heat gain is. If we look at some of the research that's been done kind of within amputees and their kind of thermal comfort, a lot of that research actually hasn't been done with athletes. It's been done with kind of office workers and people like that. And actually their thermal comfort, even within an office, is a lot lower than their able-bodied kind of co-workers, because they're not able to regulate their heat as effectively. So in terms of kind of absolute measurements, I can't give you an answer, but in terms of just what we kind of do know, a little bit from research and a little bit kind of anecdotally, yes, because the overall mechanism is disrupted, it doesn't matter kind of where the intensity is, the issues are still there. It's just obviously when you then start doing exercise and the intensity goes up, it's the kind of difference in the ability to regulate becomes even more apparent, because you've got all of that additional heat there that can't be lost.
Alex?
Yeah, I was just wondering if you have any thoughts yet about what kind of performance measures you might use.
So that's kind of one of the things we're looking to pull out in the review. A lot of the research has used kind of arm crank or just kind of cycle ergos, which we have access to. Some of the research has used like wheelchair treadmills as well, but that's not something that I don't think we currently have to do it. I think ideally if we had one of those, it'd probably be great. But at the moment, we're just kind of putting out what's being done in other studies to kind of come to the best result.
So you'd be looking at sort of more generic performance measures rather than, say, sport-specific?
Yeah, we're just trying to kind of get something that we can put the broadest amount of people through, so that we can look at what the responses are, rather than kind of having a sport-specific test similar to Mike's question. Try not to, because the research is kind of so limited at the moment, we're trying to kind of get that data set and get that information. So we're trying to kind of not narrow it too much at the moment. When we do later on and kind of follow-up studies, we haven't got to that stage yet. So,
Josh, can I just ask you, talked a lot about heat.
yes.
I'm interested to know what about thermoregulation in winter Paralympics athletes, because I can imagine it being even worse if you can't regulate heat and get colder quicker. Is it more of an issue in cold sports rather than hot sports, or is the research not really looked at that?
I mean, there isn't a huge amount of research into cold with kind of physical impairments. We focused on heat just because the tolerance to heat is a lot smaller, so you'll start to see performance effects at a much smaller temperature change kind of in heat than you would in cold. There's a much larger tolerance to cold before you start getting kind of big effects in performance. But we decided to focus on heat.
We've got one more. We've got time for one more.
So when you're talking about your heat acclimation study,
Yes.
so you've done your review, you've got your performance measures, I'm assuming you're then taking those performance measures into the heat acclimation. I assume you're only going to be able to look at one method of heat acclimation. How are you going to choose which method?
Honestly, at the moment, we don't know. That's kind of a little bit further down the road. My plan is kind of, obviously, because you've got short, medium, and long-term acclimation protocols, is kind of trying to see which ones work. Do they work? To what level do they work? Kind of the exact methodology of that, I don't know yet. That would be something that I have to buy a cup of coffee over, I think.
Can I just say a big thank you to both presenters. The Viva is going to be easy. Following this, you'll have it nailed. So can I just say you've got two students, fairly early stage in terms of their PhD, but I'm sure you'll join me in thanking them for defending and understanding the research very, very well. So congratulations on that. Thank you.